Good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to join us for this webinar. My name is Siwan Howerton, and I'm a dairy scientist at AHDB Dairy. AHDB is delighted to bring you tonight's webinar, Getting the Best Out of Your Autumn Reseeds. Our presenter today is Rod Bonshor, an agriculture crops manager for DLF, and he also manages all the seeds to advise agronomists and farmers in the grass and forage crop sector. So the plan for tonight is that Rod will be presenting on how to get the most out of your autumn reseeds this year. At a cost of between £400 and £700 a hectare, it is important that it's done correctly to maximise return on investment. And Rod will provide hints and tips on how to do this. In the webinar, we will discuss options for permanent pasture, the benefits of introducing Clover, and managing new reseeds ready for spring 2020. Tonight's webinar has proved very popular, with over 100 registrations from farmers, vets, consultants and others. We will aim to keep the webinar running smoothly, but please bear with us if we do run into any technical difficulties. Rod's presentation will take about 30-35 minutes, and then there will be time for comments and questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question, then please type your questions into the box on the left-hand side of your screens. I will ask Rod your questions at the end of his presentation, and we will aim to finish up within an hour. So without further delay, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for tonight. Rod grew up on a family dairy farm before attending university. He trained as a farm manager in his 20s, and he managed a 520-hectare arable beef and sheep farm. In 1987, Rod joined the supply industry. He is now an agriculture crops manager for DLF and manages all of his seeds. He has worked as part of the advisory team on the Grassland Research and Advisory Service Committee in the 90s, and is now a member of the Herbage Crop Committee and the British Society of Plant Breeders Herbage Project Board. So without further delay, it's over to you, Rod.
Thank you for that, Siwan. Oh, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us on this webinar, and thanks to Siwan for inviting me to talk to you. Some of the issues that we would like to cover tonight, if we're looking at the agenda, if the machine will work. A second. Just the technology beating me. I'll be with you in a second. Right, what we're trying to do is we're making sure you get the best return on investment, the benefits and challenges of introducing Clover, options for permanent pasture, and managing a new reseed. So I guess one of the first things that we have to do is plan ahead and don't rush it. Most farms these days would have a plan working the way around the farm, well aware of the benefits of reseeding, what can come with new grass leys, what the benefits are in keeping the job fresh and keeping it moving on. I think one of the first things you have to look for is that you have to consider the site that you're going to be growing the grass on. The site, first and foremost, dictates the species that you will consider, and therefore partially the output from that sward. And it's important to select the species that will do well on any given site. For instance, if it's particularly dry land, you'd be pulled towards the species that are more drought tolerant, whereas if it's wetland, you need to be looking at stuff that can do far better in wet areas. The other item that you're looking at is the duration of the ley within the farm cropping rotation, and what does the sward need to deliver to the livestock for there and the business. Other factors that govern your choice are what fertilizer policy is to be adopted. Are we going to use Clover as the engine or the oil in the engine to keep the machine going? And what's the implications to weed control if we do? Expect now to have a planned system of going around the farm, doing probably 10–20% of fields a year. This is to keep new grass in front of the animals, or indeed the enterprise, to ensure yields and production are maintained. Consider the site to be grown on. We know that if you are going to go on to lighter soils, you need species that will be able to sustain if things turn very, very dry. And similarly on wet, heavy soils, that may dictate different species to get the optimum out of those. We look at the duration of the ley within the farm cropping rotation. It may be that to fit in with legislation, you don't want anything exceeding 5 years. And we look at what does the sward need to deliver to the livestock and the business, if indeed the livestock are there. What fertilizer policy is to be adopted? Do we plan on using Clover as the oil in the engine, keep it going strongly, or are we going to use bag fertilizer? If we indeed do use Clover, what are the implications to weed control? So steps to take: primary, always do a soil test. Remedy any deficiencies that test shows. And the number of times really when we get tripped up on this one is still too often. I think it's your one chance to get it right before you start, and it will, if you can get that early establishment and that consistent flow across the field, it's worth pounds later on. Always ensure there's no underlying compaction. That's the dreaded plough pan. No other option here than to get a spade, have a dig down, find what you've got, that 10 or 12 inches down, and if there is a pan there, get it through it with the subsoiler and remedy the problem that's there. I think the other thing is discuss your aims and requirements with a reputable seed supplier. Sometimes the things we get asked are incredibly diverse, such as I want to have the top performing silage ley, but the other part of the time I want to use it as a car park or an equine events area. I don't think you can get much wider different from that, but certainly it begs a lot of discussion. Another item to consider is how you plan to sow the ley and what machinery is available. It's really key that we use the right machinery and get the right sowing depth with a lot of the species that we're dealing with now. Take time to prepare a fine, firm and level seedbed. That's the old adage, but it's never really changed. If you get that, you can optimize plant establishment. Aim for a sowing depth of 1 to 2 centimetres with most grasses that we're dealing with, but if you've got Timothy and Clover in the mix, 1 centimetre is better. Both those species prefer to be what we call surface sown, so they can literally be put on the top and Cambridge rolled in. If you're using a seed drill, then cross drill or surface broadcast. By surface broadcast, what we often mean is you can pull the tubes out the coulters on quite a few of the drills, and that allows you to get the seed closer to the soil surface. So in actual fact, you're within 6 inches of the soil. And often if there's not a roller on the back of the drill, you can just follow with a Cambridge roll, and that pushes seed nicely into the surface. It's worthwhile noting that if you put most forage grasses in lines, they stay in lines, and that leaves you room for weeds. It also means that the more the sun sees the soil, the quicker the soil dries out. So the more ground cover you get, and certainly if you're grazing, the better off that you'll be. Finish off with a Cambridge roll. This is to give you a firm seed bed, conserve moisture and speed your establishment. Side benefit is also this will limit the mobility of pests across soil and through the upper layer of the soil. Probably one of the things that you ought to be very cautious of is a flat roll. I've seen more problems with a flat roll than I've seen solutions. It's got a nasty tendency to cap the top of the field. And the big problem really is if it does hammer down with rain thereafter, it's got a way of washing seed into runnels together, whereas the Cambridge roll gives you a nice ridged finish, also a little bit of shelter at ground level when the seeds are coming through. So you check the new seeds regularly to plan any countermeasures to pests, weeds, etc. And just keep your eye on them as they're coming through in those first few weeks and months. So the site to be grown on, the UK is currently an 85% ryegrass market, unlikely to change too much in the future, although there is far more interest in other species as we've seen in recent months. I think you have to remember ryegrass is bred to be fed, and its recommended list results are from a 3-year trial system where it receives probably 300 kilos of nitrogen. And the list is a really useful guide to varietal performance, and we do need that list. But you've just got to remember, if you come away from implications of standard fertilizer and start using slurry and different methods and lower N rates, it's interesting what other species can and cannot do. As recent years have shown, the site and climate dictates the output from the grass sward. So you probably should consider the attributes of species that survive and perform better on certain sites, such as cocksfoot, meadowfescue, timothy, and the new festiloliums that have come into the market recently. One of the other things we see is a fairly clear east-west climatic divide along the spine of England. It seems odd to a man in Kent that you're talking about flooding when a man in Cumbria doesn't really want to talk about drought, for instance. So there are wide differences throughout the British Isles. So what do all these species do? The graph that you're seeing now shows tons of dry matter per hectare. The left-hand column, the species we've just mentioned, perennial ryegrass, timothy, cocksfoot, meadowfescue in the graph there. And you can see under this is the 3rd year of a cutting regime, they're all capable of doing around 13 tons of dry matter to the hectare. So essentially, none of them will let you down in terms of yield performance. There are differences in palatability and forage quality, but first and foremost, get the thing there, get it established and get it growing for you. So that's England and Wales primarily. This is information from Ireland. It's a yield comparison of 4-year trial with 3 seasonal periods over 3 sites in Ireland. Same format, left-hand column gives you tons of dry matter per hectare. Bottom of the graph gives you perennial ryegrass, timothy, cocksfoot, meadowfescue, and tall fescue in this case. Quite interesting seeing that here, they don't call it the Emerald Isle for no reason, and actually the yield is up slightly to about 14 tons of dry matter per hectare. So that rainfall's going to good use, obviously. So comforting to see that throughout our British Isles, the results are consistent. So if we look at the site to be grown on, for a fertilizer regime to work, moisture has to be available. I know that sounds obvious, but it does limit the response time of the grass species, and the shallower rooted ones are more prone to stress than those that dig down deeper. The deeper rooted species can access more moisture, minerals, nutrients, and help aerate the soil profile. This means they're more productive in dry conditions, especially when you team them with legumes, such as red clover. Similarly, on a wet soil under low nitrogen, timothy and meadowfescue can proliferate. This looks quite a busy slide, but just work with me on it. On the top, you see the first Parcane species, which starts at Westerwold, working down through Italian ryegrass, hybrids, perennials, timothy, meadowfescue, cocksfoot. On the bottom, you see festilolium. The ST actually stands for short term, and the LT stands for long term. On the top, there's some of the parameters that you'd expect from the species and things that you'd probably consider. You've got yield, feeding value, spring growth, persistence, and speed of establishment. The first one's Westerwold ryegrass, and you can see it's got the highest growth energy and the highest yield potential of any of the grasses. It is an annual ryegrass. That means it can head from a spring sowing. Anybody wishing to grow haylage would be particularly interested in that, for instance, or anybody wanting things to bulk up quickly for silage. That's a must from a spring sowing if you must have that yield in that first year. So everything about it is vigorous, speed of establishment particularly, but that energy comes at a price, and the price is persistence. And you can see there that it's not particularly persistent as a species. It's usually in 1-year leys. The better, newer varieties will do up to 2 years, but that involves not scalping them and feeding them. So the feeding value is good, spring growth's okay. As I say, persistence is poor in terms of against long-term grasses, but the real ace in the pack is the speed of establishment. Italian ryegrass next in line. Italians will usually last for about 2 years. Again, yield potential is very high, feeding value high, spring growth okay. Persistence slightly better than Westerwolds, but not up to the level of perennial ryegrass. And again, speed of establishment is very good. If you're looking at hybrid ryegrasses, most of the traditional hybrids are crosses of Italian and perennial, and they tend to favour either parent. The perennial types, the harder you hit them, the leafier they get. The Italian types probably have better spring growth, but probably aren't as persistent. It's been a really interesting crossover of species, and we tend to find that these work well for dual purpose ley mixtures. Then you're into perennial ryegrass, and you can see of all the factors there, yield is good, feeding value good, spring growth a little bit slower than some of the subspecies, persistence is usually good, as is the speed of establishment. This is where ryegrass has been particularly popular, all those ryegrass species we've mentioned. Most of them, you'll sow them and you'll see the green sheen across the field in a couple of weeks. So as you're chasing the calendar into the winter and thinking to yourself, I've got to get on, I've got to get things in the ground, there's a comfort in knowing that perennial ryegrass is particularly vigorous. You'll also know that if you want to repair or overseed a ley, those species, the perennials and the hybrids, if you don't want to get into short-term material, probably offer you the best opportunity of getting established in what is an adverse situation, where it's got to compete with a plant that's already got roots. So most of the overseeding mixtures would have larger seeded, vigorous grasses, which tend to come from that hybrid and perennial category. The next three species, Timothy, Meadowfescue and Cocksfoot, you can see speed of establishment is less than the ryegrass family. But what's interesting is if you marry that back against the persistence level, once you do get them going, they're far more persistent. Spring growth is better, they're really good spring grasses, and particularly in things like Meadowfescue and Cocksfoot, once the initial defoliation's happened, even with the traditional Cocksfoots, the summer growth thereafter is very good. You've just got silky shoots. The newer material actually, where the leaves are far softer and silkier, the feed quality is better on the newer Cocksfoots than some of the old ones. Festilolium short term, really that is a cross of Italian ryegrass and Meadowfescue mainly, and Festilolium long term are the ones where there tend to be perennials and tall fescue crosses, and you can see that the short terms mirror the hybrids and Italians, and the long terms are getting more into perennial ryegrass and the other indigenous species category. Very persistent when you get them going, so an interesting step forward in the breeding aspect. So what you'd think is, right, okay, I want to get my ley in, I want to get things established, and here we are on the first week of September. When we say those Timothy, Meadowfescue and Cocksfoots are somewhat slower than ryegrass, if you imagine that you're going to see the green sheen with ryegrass in 2 weeks, it would probably take 4 weeks to get the same effect with the aforementioned species. So if I was going to put a ley in with those in, I'd want it in the ground in the next couple of weeks. Hales Farm is where we do a lot of trials work, probably the largest grass testing facility in the UK these days. It's also part of the BSBB grass trials matrix that makes up the recommended list. And we always find it interesting to have a look at the rainfall, and quite interesting to look at 2018. That gave us a challenge, to put it mildly. The red bars you're looking at are the 30-year average, and the blue bars show the total rain for 2018. And what you see in March, for instance, is 50 mil rainfall is the 30-year normal. We ended up with 125, so more than double. Yet in June, where the average is 60 mil, we end up with nearly nothing. What really stares at you out of that graph is August, the wettest month of the year on average over the last 30 years. So if you were a betting man and you were looking at getting a grass ley established, August, when the soils are warm, when there's plenty of moisture about, would seem to be the optimum time. Hales Farm sits between Cheltenham and Stratford, kind of in the middle of England, and I'm well aware that other areas could point to different graphs. However, if I'd overlaid the temperature graph against the rainfall graph, you would see the other thing that haunts us in the spring is usually it's usually dry and cold. Obviously, spring 18 changes that, but I would say spring 18 changed a lot of things. So if we look at that's 2018, 2019, this has been a far better growing year, a far more normal year in terms of weather patterns, in terms of rainfall, and in terms of temperature. June it absolutely bucketed down, as you can see, so we did have a very wet June at Hales Farm. In actual fact, August is nearly bang on the 30-year average with about 75 mil. So it doesn't change. I think it's still there. We have to work with nature and not against it, and that seems to me to be the optimum time to be looking at grass reseeding. Well aware that in the north, as day length decreases quicker, temperatures are different, the north does tend to be more of a spring market. So just trying to give an overview of the bulk of the British Isles and what you may consider the best time to be thinking of reseeding. So what does the sward need to deliver? You select your species appropriate to your site and soil type. You consider how long you want the lay to last and the quantity of forage that you require. Under cutting, 3-year ryegrass lays may produce about 17.5 tonne of dry matter per hectare per year over that period. But if you've got a 5-year lay, it may average out about 14 tonne of dry matter per hectare per year. There's a yield penalty for each year that passes. If you're going for cutting, you tend to look for more erect grasses that are easily harvested and where you want your grass silage to fit into the total ration. Nothing works in an animal like grass fibre, so it's vital to balance that against other high energy silages like maize. Similarly, high protein is available from legumes like red clover if you want to add that into your cutting lay. If we're looking at grazing, I've actually put there vital to get good establishment if long-term sustained performance is expected. It's vital to get good establishment anyway. I guess the overrider in this, if you've got big heavy animals wandering around, you want to avoid poaching at all costs. One of the ways you're doing that is to get a persistent and dense lay. So you're looking for persistency, you're looking particularly for disease resistance, you're looking for forage quality and palatability. Disease in recent times, we're seeing far more leaf spot than we ever saw before. It's quite interesting. A lot of the tetraploid varieties are actually more resistant to leaf spot than the diploids. Diploids are somewhat denser. Saw that quite dramatically in varieties that got good disease ratings actually for leaf spots, but it still seemed to be getting some of the diploid varieties. You consider seed rates for sward density. Don't think about an acre pack, think about the seed bed, because the seed bed should dictate the seed rate. If it comes down nice and fine, that's great. You can look at about 13, 14 kilos. If it's still cobbly, the first question is, should you be on it anyway to sow it? But if that's the case, you need to be tweaking upwards to 15 to 16. You're aiming to even out the growing year where possible for best utilisation of the forage. So you want to take some of the grass away from the May peak and try and push it earlier in the year and later into the summer. And remember that clover will reduce the need for bag nitrogen and will increase the protein content of the sward, but it'll also affect the agronomy costs if weed invasion is a problem and you're considering spraying. This is a cost of reseeding slide. I kept it pretty brief. The first top bar shows pucker reseeding starting into fresh soil. The writing in red is farmer own, and I'm assuming the blue writing is for contract charges. So we're on reseeding per se, we're against slot seeding and then overseeding with a grass harrow. Not a lot of difference between those two. Desiccation will be spraying off with glyphosate, 35 quid with a contractor, probably 30 quid if you did it yourself. Weed control otherwise would probably be in around about the £30 per hectare mark. Obviously, if you're ploughing, pressing, one pass tillage, your cost starts to rise, as does double ring rolling, which you might have to do if you've got a grass harrow with no roller on it. You'd still have to probably roll it twice. The grass seed with a harrow, cost with that is not too bad, about £31 a hectare. If you cross drilling, it's more expensive, running up to 74 quid. Obviously, finish off with a ring roll, unless the slot seeding machine has a ring roll on the back. Seed cost, I'm assuming the same lay used all the way through, the difference being that on a full reseed, you've got to go to probably 14 kilos, and the slot seed, beg your pardon, 35 kilos a hectare, whereas slot seeding and overseeding, you want to be on about 25 kilos. So the cost would rise higher for a long-term lay, around about £165. But as Siwan said right at the start, your reseeding costs are probably about £400 a hectare when you're using people outside the farm. Slot seeding and overseeding coming in at 223 and 226. That's why it appears to be gaining a little bit in popularity. But you have to remember, it can only be a solution if the lay isn't completely invaded by weed grasses or destroyed. Just pass on that. That was just a more detail. So is it value for money? Milk from forage has dropped over the last 10 years from about 2,500 litres per cow to 2,280. Homegrown crops are our cheapest form of producing milk or meat. And profit actually comes from how many kilos of forage dry matter we utilise, as opposed to how many litres of milk we produce. Yields from old lays have ranged from 6 to 8.5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, depending on how worn out the old lay is. And where new lays achieve 13 to 15 tonnes of dry matter per hectare, the yield difference is about 7 tonnes of dry matter. So if you wanted to try and get a value on that, probably a half-tonne bale of silage may be worth about 20 quid today. It's worth double that 6 months ago. But if that becomes a half-tonne bale, that's £40 a tonne. So 7 tonnes has a value of £280 per hectare. And we're talking about £400 to reseed. And you're getting higher stocking rate, you're getting higher quality, and you're getting more efficient fertilizer use. So I would suggest it really is value for money. So if we wanted to summarize that, if we're looking at reseeding, given we're in the right geographic area, autumn is nature's time when the moisture and the warmth tends to be there. Spring, we'll run the old gauntlet. Is it too dry? Is it too wet? And is it too cold? Always do your soil test. Make sure your seed bed is fine, firm and level. And if you're sowing, I would say look at broadcasting. It's probably the best solution in most scenarios. Depth of sowing is absolutely crucial. Keep it shallow. Use your Cambridge roller wisely. Make sure your fertilizer levels are correct in terms of the fertility of the field and any surface fertilizer that you need to use. And make sure that the pests don't get free rein when the grass is actually starting to come up and really doing well, particularly your legumes. The legumes do suffer from Mars bar syndrome, and the slug will come and you'll have those first if you can. So just bear that in mind, particularly if you're after a high clover lay. So the benefits and challenges of introducing clover. Red clover, about 430,000 seeds per kilo, emerges 5 to 15 days after sowing, really vigorous in the spring. You've got early and late flowering types, it's got high nutritional value, and the best performance is in the first 3 years. Really drought resistant because it's deep rooting, and a good companion crop for grass, as it can contribute anywhere from 150 kilos plus of nitrogen per hectare per year to companion grasses. I think it's fair to say there that in a spring like 2018, where it was wet and cold for a prolonged period of time, a lot of the clover was underneath the grass canopy, and it suffered accordingly. I know it played havoc with the clover populations down at Didbrook, but that's something just to bear in mind. That would have an impact on your clover presence, particularly in a year like 2018. If you're growing it as a pure stand, you get 12 tonne of dry matter per hectare per year over those 3 years. I don't think too many people have a pure stand. Most would mix it with grass. And just to mention there, lucerne, or alfalfa, as the Americans will have it, it's very similar to red clover, but usually grown as a monoculture. The yield is about 14 tonne of dry matter per hectare over 2 years, but most people would put it in as a 4 to 5 year crop. Proving particularly useful, actually, because we can use a lot of the oilseed rape chemistry on things like lucerne. So it is an interesting weapon in the quiver to use against blackgrass particularly. So potential there, but an alternative to red clover leys. So what have you got that's the benefit of red clover? High dry matter yield, high true protein. It's largely protected from degradation, and you can get up to 22%. Really drought tolerant. It's compatible with grasses, adapted to most soils and regions, offers flexibility of management and high level of aerobic stability. That's the good points. The bad points, you've got low dry matter and little sugar, so that can have effect on your fermentation. Low ME and a need for a 4-year rotational break. Estrogen levels can cause issues, and there is a bloat risk. Another downside could be it's only 3-year persistence, and although the new varieties are getting better, to be fair, and it can complicate and increase the cost of weed control. It's very aggressive in mixtures, particularly in a dry summer. You tend to find you get a field of mainly clover with little grass in it. It's not particularly persistent under hard grazing, and it's alleged to increase nitrogen and ammonia in watercourses. So, fors and against on red clover. White clovers are about 1.5 million seeds per kilo, and again, emergence is relatively quick, 5 to 15 days after sowing. But that kind of answers a question to you. Whenever you see a red clover lay, you'll probably see there's about 3 kilos of seed per acre in a bag, whereas white clover there's only ever 1 kilo, but you're still getting the same number of seeds to give you that potential number of plants per acre. In white clover, you've got small, medium and large leaf varieties. The top yield of a white clover on its own is only about 5 tonne of dry matter per hectare, so different from red. But if you twin it up with grass, you can get to about 11 to 12 tonne of dry matter to the hectare. White clover has really high nutritional value and is very palatable, even when it's flowering. So a good companion for grass as fixes nitrogen. I think it's fair to say it only starts releasing the nitrogen when it starts being managed, cut or grazed. It's really persistent as it's stoloniferous, it creeps along the top, and it's very winter hardy, so useful for summer production. You have to watch with red clover. If it's on really heavy wet soil, the root can rot, whereas white clover will go along the top and would be probably more forgiving in that scenario. Large varieties for cutting and dairy grazing, medium for dual purpose, and small varieties for sheep and or fertility builders. So white clover can improve intake of grazing livestock. It can add summer growth to grass mixtures. It'll improve the mineral and protein content of swards, and it can contribute, again, about 150 kilos of N per hectare per year to companion grasses. And if you grow it with that grass, you can increase the final yield or the total yield of the two by about 25%. That's the good. What's the bad? It complicates and increases the cost of weed control. It can be oversown into an autumn sown grass only sward the following year. I've put that as a negative because it's another job to do. Some would say it's a positive, but it's just going to be another cost for you. But it is a way of dealing with going grass only, controlling weeds that you don't want there relatively cheaply, or adding your clover thereafter when the conditions are right in the following year. Same as red clover, you can have a buffering effect on silage fermentation, and the protein can break down during the ensiling process. So something to pickle it with is not a bad idea. You do get bloat risk at higher clover levels, and you can get yield variation year to year. So I think with white clover, you'd say it's great for grazing. Just use a bit of care for silage. And if you are going to use it for silage, cut when your grass is dominant. So there's plenty of sugar there to help in the ensiling process. So introducing clover, this is something that attracts quite a bit of comment. I already mentioned clover prefers to be surface sown. So if you sow it too deep, you won't see that much of it, or it will be incredibly slow getting going. And it's relatively straightforward to put it into a young grass sward, because a young grass sward will be relatively open. So you could put it on the top with a slug bike and literally Cambridge roll it in. Careful choice of machinery required as seed rates are low. 1 to 3 kilos per acre is the norm. The organic farmers will be more interested in going higher because they can't use any bag fertilizer. It may be necessary to bulk up with grass seed if your machine doesn't go that far down in terms of seed rate. I've heard of people feeding clover seed with barley in the trough to be deposited on the ground ready fertilized. They've all told me it's worked, but I don't know how you're going to look at seed rate and uniformity. And similarly, people have put it through a slurry tanker and they've also claimed success, but the same as above. I guess it's finding its own way in from there. I personally believe the best options are a slug pellet applicator or a dedicated and properly calibrated machine, and follow this on with a ring roller just to push it into the soil. So options for permanent pasture and repair. You've got a lower establishment cost if all you want to do is repair. You avoid any risk of soil erosion because you're not moving the soil around. You've got a reduction in time of house production where grass is not desiccated prior to seeding. And some drills will work when it's too dry to plough. So you can establish grass while maintaining good soil structure on unstable soils. This is probably especially true on your organic soils or your heavy clays. A re-established sward is far more resistant to poaching. But before looking at anything like this, you've really got to identify the problem. What went wrong in the first place that the old sward went downhill as it did. So you look at it, and first thing you want to check, is there a soil structure problem? Have we got compaction in there? Is something not quite right? Is there a problem with the pH or the nutrients? And probably look back and think to yourself, how well did the previous sward establish? And again, I'll go back to 2018. Certainly in the Midlands, we had hardly any rainfall through September and October in 2018. And walking swards in November, we had little grass plants just coming through, but we had a really mild winter, so we got away with it. It may well be in some scenarios, if you're forced into a late sowing and it doesn't thicken up as well as it should, that could be the reason it never established properly in the first place. Therefore, it opens up. Therefore, you get more weeds in it. And I guess the other question that then comes into that, was the previous mixture appropriate for the use and required duration? Or did you change your mind? Was there a then need to go to a different regime? That all has impact on what you chose to do and what you sowed, what you actually sowed in the field, and its longevity. So you identify the problem. We've already said when we looked at the table on species, the large seeded aggressive ones are the ones to go for if you're looking for renovation. I'm not necessarily talking about Italians in this, I'm talking about the perennials and the hybrids. They will facilitate rapid establishment, they'll give you accelerated growth, and it can be in that hostile environment when everything else has already got a root. There are certain things out there that are working really, really well. We've got nitrogen coated seed available these days, and clovers, though relatively slow to establish, do prefer to be surface sown, so they're introduced using the pasture renovation techniques. And it's important to allow an appropriate time for the crop to establish before introducing grazing animals, usually about 6 weeks. So you're going to correct any compaction to aerate the soil and facilitate drainage, put your pH right and your pK, take out any broadleaf weeds. Not worth sowing into swards with heavy infestations of the invasive grasses like couch or bent. Total reseed required here. The field must be mown immediately prior to sowing or really graze tight, and that'll maximise your soil contact and ensure availability of light to your new seedlings. So the objective with any sowing is get soil to seed contact. If your seed doesn't go on the soil, it will not grow. You need access to moisture, nutrients. This results in a more rapid establishment. All those methods of putting the seed in will introduce your seed into a challenging environment, so as much help as you can give it. So think about the planning, the timing, and make sure you've got somebody on that machine who knows what they're doing. We'll just pass on the seeders direct drills. So if you post sowing and raking, you roll the field both ways with your Cambridge roll. A light application of slurry doesn't go amiss because it's a bit like a liquid fertilizer in some respects, but you would want to wait for 2 to 3 weeks before applying bag den to allow your new seeds to put a root out. Watch for your pests, and if soil conditions allow, the livestock can go back into the field immediately after sowing, certainly for 7 to 10 days. They'll help tread the seed in. It'll reduce competition from the existing sward because they'll be chewing it off. But please take the stock out if your new seedlings are starting to emerge, or they will pull them out by the roots. Certainly sheep will. So how to summarise, just drawing this to a close. If you're on to the management of the sward, post-establishment, everything's going fine. It's all through the ground, it's all moving forward. You check uniform establishment, and if possible, if things haven't come particularly well in any area, oversow it then if you absolutely can. If not, it will have to wait till later in the spring. You fertilise as per usual recommendations. This hasn't changed a lot, around 2.5 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per day, but does depend on your regime, and it does depend on what you're wishing to achieve within your enterprise. Take out your weeds early if you can. It's far easier to do it when they're small than when they're large. And don't scalp or overgrade, especially in dry times. Well worthwhile checking the heights of your mowers. Actually, the crown of the grass plant isn't worth as much to you as the leaf. So maintaining a sensible mower height is really crucial in assisting a sward in longevity. The easiest way to make it die quicker is to cut it tighter, and especially in a dry time. Keep an eye out for disease. If it is getting particularly dirty, you might have to remove it and dump it, and it's easy to say that in a year when we've got plenty of grass. It's not so easy to say it in a year like last year when we had very little. But disease leaf doesn't do anything a lot of favours, so remove that as soon as you can, and make sure that your sward goes into the winter relatively short. When we're saying relatively short, if you can get it to about 6 inches, 4 to 6 inches, that's ideal. So that would be a process of looking at the management of the sward post-establishment. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for the interruption in the technology, and I think it's up to me now to hand you back to stay on.
Many thanks, Rod. That was a very interesting presentation. I'll just remind everyone that you can type in your questions in that little box on your screen. I'll also just remind you that tonight's presentation has been recorded and will be available to watch back on AHDB's website along with previous webinars. I have sent you a few links in the chat box to AHDB's grassland reseeding guide and also some recommended grass and clover list, which hopefully you'll find useful. So we'll kick off straight into the question. So the first question, Rod, is could you further define the 300 kilograms of nitrogen, please? Is it per hectare, per year, or per acre?
It's kilos of hectare per year, as in RB 209.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is from James. If a long-term ley is going to be reseeded, is a break crop needed to stop build-up of pest and larvae?
Stop build up of what, sorry?
Pests.
Pests and larvae. Yeah, I mean, or if you can do any break in between any crop, it's always beneficial. These days we haven't got much to control things like fruit fly and leather jacket, so one sure way of doing that is to actually pull up a long-term lay in the late spring, probably after you've taken the first cut off it, then put in a forage brassica, so you've got something there growing for a few weeks that destroys the green bridge, that allows some of the pests to carry over and give you an opportunity to go back in at the end of August time or September with a grass reseed.
Great, thank you very much. A question from Ruth. Why does adding clover affect weed control?
That's in case, wait, how does it affect weed control? It depends on the field that it's going into is the answer to that. If you've got clean fields and no real problem with weeds, that's fantastic. If you do have a situation where you get a lot of invasive weeds coming in, there are not that many chemicals cleared these days for weed control in grass and clover leys.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is, if planting a herbal ley, is it better to plant grass to allow spraying weeds and then put the legumes in the following spring?
If it's a dirty field, definitely. With the herbal leys, where we're using more than clovers, we're using various herbs. There is no chemical that we've got that would be selective enough to take weeds out of that scenario that I'm aware of. So the most logical thing to do, bearing in mind that the herbs and the clover will be your most expensive item, would be to go to grass only and then take out the undesirables and put your herbs and your clovers in after. There is another way around that, and that's probably to do what some of the organic farmers do and go for a false seed bed first, so that you would be able to reduce your weed burden significantly and go in with your dedicated mix into a clean seed bed.
Perfect, thanks Rod. The next question is from Jonathan. What is the feed value of vetch in a sward? Is it better to cut as a green crop or with seed pods?
Vetch, feed value of vetch can be very good. It's of the legume family, so you'd expect the protein levels to be high and the sugar's very low, but most of the clovers or the legume family are grown for the protein first. I'm not actually sure what the percentages are, but I would envisage them to be in the region of the red clover leys, somewhere 18 to 24%, I would imagine.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is, if you have a reseed that's been dominated by weeds, what would be your advice? Would you start again, or what would you advise in that situation?
If it's dominated by weeds, it's probably gone wrong in the first place. And if that's the scenario, you're better just to bite the bullet and reseed and start all over afresh. One of the issues that you might have if it's been dominated by weeds is you've probably got a lot of weed seed shed on there as well. So if you go in next time round, you probably find there's another population in there if you don't plough it deep and pack it down. Even then, if there's a lot in the soil bank, as it were, you'll probably find another flush coming. So it would be a good idea for a break crop in that scenario.
Perfect, thank you. Another question that's come in is, we've had a situation with a field this year that has a big patch that hasn't taken reseed. Have you seen anything like that before, and can you think of any reasons why they might have seen that?
Just a patch in the field, did you say, Siwan?
Yeah, that's where the questions come through as.
I have seen things like that, and what it can be, sometimes in fields you get acid patches. One of the issues we face in soil testing, a soil test gives you an average across the field, so you might find some parts are 6 and some are 7, and the average is 6.5. But in certain areas, for whatever reason, a patch dives down on pH. So you probably get down to 5.5 and the rest of the field comes and looks fine. But this one patch just sits dead and looks at you. best thing to do is literally soil test the patch, find out what it tells you on the analysis, and then you might be able to remedy that. But if it's a patch in a field, chances are the rest of the field may be following suit. So it might be just the lower end of a bigger problem in the rest of the field. That's assuming that we're talking about lime and acid. But a soil test could show you it could be phosphate, it could be potash, it could be one of your base elements that you just need to correct.
Perfect, that's great, thank you, Rod. We've got a question from Mark. Mark's question is, can you explain a little bit on the concept of high sugar?
High sugar, high sugar's been with us for some time. Sugar actually rises through the grass plant during the day. So that's why Grandad always told you to cut your grass in the afternoon, because that's when sugar levels were higher. Historically, the tetraploid grasses have been higher in sugar than diploids, and the ratio depends what you're looking at, but it can be anywhere usually from 18 to 24%. It's relative to the how would you say define it? It's where one is perceived to be a higher sugar level than another, I would suggest. But I don't think you should get isolated on one topic. Sugar is only one part of the story, and it tends to be that if you've got a grass with a high sugar, it tends to be lower in protein. So as you gain in one, you trade off in another.
Great, thank you. A question from Dan, is pulling the only option for controlling ragwort in an organic system? Does topping just make it more persistent?
If you've got ragwort, it needs to be in the root, and everything needs to come out. So pulling is one solution. There was at one time an oil that its name escapes me tonight, but I can't remember if that was allowed under organic systems. Yeah, ragwort would be the bane of your life under an organic regime if it got established, I would imagine. And the only sure way is to get the whole of the plant out of the ground.
Great, thank you. A question from Nigel. With milk from forage going down, what do you think is going wrong with the knowledge transfer between the industry and the farmer?
All these things are a snap in time, and I think that what's probably happened is we're seeking high output with a lot of herds inside, and maybe we're using more alternative forages or more different forages than what we probably could. That's easier said than done. So one of the ways of remedying around that would be to have a close look at the forages that you can produce on your farm, particularly in the way of protein, and see if that's not one way of saving a bit of money and pushing back the other way so we don't have to buy in as much. But it all spins and hinges around the ration fed to the animals and what's economic for that particular farm to do in that particular area.
Perfect, thanks Rod. And I think we are coming to the end of our questions now, so this is your last chance to type your questions if anyone has got any others. So second from last at the moment is, what makes for the extra growth in the first year of a reseed? Is it the extra nitrogen from previous sward or type of grasses? It's
integral vigour of the grass. The big hitter is always the first year after being reseeded. So if you sow a ley now, its best production should be in 2020, and then you find that gradually there's an incremental drop year on year as you go along, certainly with the ryegrass family. But that's why I think what's most visually impressive is when you go for that first year, it's that vigour that new seeds contain that enable them to withstand more drought, to recover quicker, to yield higher, and one reason to keep moving new grass around your farm.
Great, thank you. And the final question for tonight is, I have a field of that was used for standing hay, and within the field, due to wet weather conditions this summer, there's some bare patches. What would you recommend? Would you recommend that do you stitch, or would you put that paddock into a complete reseed?
It depends how long the lay's been down. If you sowed it as a hay lay with an intention of keeping it down 5 years or 7 years, and that time's now up, the answer is to reseed it anyway, because the lay was probably designed over that period. If it's still a relatively young lay that you don't believe has achieved its full potential and got to the time period that you wanted, there probably would be an opportunity to overseed it and bulk it up again. But it would require some discussion as to see exactly what you wanted to do and the area involved.
Perfect, thank you very much. So a big thank you for all of you for listening to this webinar tonight. We've had a great turnout and participation in this webinar. Please keep an eye out on the AHDB events page for future webinars. A very special thank you to Rod for taking time out of his busy day. I'd just like to remind everyone that if anyone do require basis points, if you could just drop us an email and we'll get that organised for you for this webinar. The recording of this webinar will be available to watch back on the AHDB website in due course, and all of those that have registered will receive an email alerting you when it's live on the website. Thank you all and good night.